Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Confident Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I've got my special guest, Emily. Emily, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Tom. Good to see you again. Yeah, happy to introduce myself. I'm Emily Easley, founder of Novus Energy Advisors, a boutique consulting and advisory firm that I started about a decade ago. And after now 20 years in the energy business, it's evolved across all the technologies, and we work with companies big and small on trying to make smart, wise decisions and investments across the energy landscape. And I'm excited to be here with you today, just in your theme with your podcast and trying to find some positive opportunities in what seems to be kind of a chaotic macro environment politically. So,
Sure.
look forward to talking about it.
Great. So, before we get into that, let me just ask you quickly, who are your customers and what kind of problems are you solving for them?
So we primarily work with oil and gas companies and oil and gas professionals, I would say, like career professionals. So this started in the early 2000s. I moved to DC, and we were working with the electric utilities that were in a similar but different ballpark and trying to assess how their business models were going to change with the renewable penetration. And so Novus launched a similar service, but for the corporates that are big public companies to small investment arms, and helping them navigate what their sweet spot is, their expertise, and then how to expand on that and not necessarily pivot but grow into this energy transition.
Right.
And so, it's now we're doing a lot of below the ground renewable decarbonization work, but it started largely, and it still does, as to we need to watch every aspect of above the ground, and it is just equally important.
Okay. And what's your own background? How did you get into the energy space?
It's a great question. I mean, so, and I think I alluded to this, that I am, all things energy all the time. I find it a fascinating industry, largely early days as a little girl. I wanted to know what my dad was leaving the house to do every day, and he was in the oil and gas business, and I wanted to understand how that how his work came into. I can remember on Sunday mornings, like going to get gasoline for the car right before church, and I mean I can even remember the smell of it as a little girl. It was 99 cents, and I kept asking him, saying, "Is this what you do? Do you pump gas? No. Like, how does it relate to me?" And then he'd nag about the light switches in the house, of turning those off. And this is before any smart home, right? The 80s. And say, "Is this what you do? How does what your investments," and he puts deals together, right? And so from there, I went to Vanderbilt, and knew that I didn't necessarily have the capacity to study as hard as all those engineers out there, and the technical challenges I had such respect for. I wanted to get into the business side of it, and we studied kind of the soft side of business at the time when Enron was kind of the rise and fall. And it was fascinating to see what human capital had as far as leadership impact on businesses. And so from there, it was truly a soft side of business degree and case studies that, to me, looking back, is very similar to a lot of what you're seeing in ESG, more boardroom oversight. And we studied a lot of, like, how military organizations work and the successes of organizations and cultures. And so I just kept my interest in energy. And at the time, it was very early in the renewable space. I'm from Texas. That was not even anything that Texas was doing. And it was shale revolution. And so I ended up in the solar business. It took a while to get there. I definitely tried a little bit of the political entry level interview routes, and that just wasn't meant for me. And so I've stuck with it. I mean, and frankly, our business now has evolved where, very similar to the early days of working with the electric utilities, we pull together information and then really make recommendations on who those experts are in these various fields, but looking at it from, okay, your business strategy, where have you been successful in the past? look at your own human capital and their capabilities, and then how can you build a real strong business plan and platform to grow with all of the change. So we follow the policy, we look at the implications of changes of policy, we follow the technology and all of those that we know in the industry and where they're evolving. And then if you look at the different markets and kind of assessing where the key opportunities are, you're going to be just a more intelligent operation overall.
Sure. Plenty of changes happening in the market at the moment. We'll get into them. But before we do, I got to think it's got to be a little bit different being a woman in the energy space, because a lot of that space is male dominated, particularly in Texas, right?
It is. I mean, and I think I shared this with you before. I frankly, I enjoy it in a way that it's more black and white. I was in event planning early on, and it was very female dominated, but more so, I think it's the expertise that, and back to your original question of how I got into it. I was a cheerleader in high school, right? Like, I mean, but I was always on this. There's something else that was driving my interest, and so I think that the world is so different than it was 20 years ago. There's not a lot of diversity in the renewable business.
Right.
There's a lot of male figures there too. So it's changing, it's evolving. I mean, I think across the board, attracting the diversity to an industry that has traditionally been one way is just kind of part of it. But I don't think too much about it. And we work with some fabulous men and women.
Okay, great. So tell me a little bit then about Novus, about, what are we've seen that there are a lot of changes happening at the moment. What are the big trends? What are the big things your customers are approaching you now to say, help me with this?
Sure. I mean, I think one example, just in what the EPA ruled in the tailpipe regulation yesterday, that you look at that one component, and EPA under different administrations has different thresholds. And so, but what does that ultimately do to the corporate decision making and where you're going to invest? And then how far upstream does that impact? And what is realistic in the pendulum, right? And so, it's interesting for us because it does impact the oil and gas business. It does impact, biofuels, but it also is a new evolution right now of U.S. manufacturing, and the automakers are behind it. So if the automakers are behind it and they're investing in building out U.S. cars that are also electric vehicles, and there's incentives for it, it's a complex issue, right? I mean, I tend to wonder, did it just make my Yukon price actually be more valuable because there's just going to be less of them, and I like my SUV that doesn't have to plug in. So and it's not to say that I'm not clearly very environmentally conscious of everything, but for me as a mom of 3 kids, like, I need to know that if the power goes out, that I'm not going to be without a car, without a vehicle to get out of that place. So, I mean, I think the world is changing and evolving, and we look at it from that holistic view. And then we say, okay, from an upstream company, as you're, looking at do you ramp up production? Do you hedge? How are you assessing what this could mean for you? Not today, tomorrow, but in 3 years or in 5 years, under what is maybe post this first time former presidents running against each other. Because once policy is announced and industry gets behind it, politicians can say everything that they want to say about what they intend to do,
right?
And so it's important to know, well, what is the law, and historically what has happened, because you can make some pretty good predictions on the future there. And so, with that, who we work with now compared to who we were working with 10 years ago, these are oil and gas executives largely that have moved into carbon capture and sequestration, or, in an effort to kind of maximize what their experience taught them as far as the geological elements of where these best locations are for storage. But then there's also a lot of interesting innovation going around the utilization of, and so we've looked at from a market perspective, how do you ensure that not only you're kind of navigating the regulatory environment around this emerging industry that really is taking off globally. I know that you're seeing it abroad too. And then how do you ensure that, our direct air capture clients, that we really are just so unbelievably impressed with their drive and what they're trying to conquer, but that it's clean power and it's reliable too.
Right.
So there's a convergence of all of these factors.
Interesting. Just going back to the EV front for a second, I'm a third-time EV owner. So just when you talk about when the power goes out, not being able to charge your car, it's the same for a petrol car or a diesel car. If the power goes out, you can't fill them either because the pumps at fuel stations run on electricity as well. So that typically wouldn't be an issue.
It's interesting though, because and this is just as a homeowner, and you and I can talk about EVs offline, because I clearly, may be, I'm actually annoyed at my oil light that keeps going, time to change your oil. That would be a nice one to not have to worry about. But the point of, I think more broadly, what is a bigger issue is cybersecurity and vulnerability to electricity just in general. So, I say that as a side note of a personal view, but I do think from what's happening as far as control and electrification and kind of the vulnerability similar to what you saw with, with Russia and Ukraine, like energy is a first line of mechanism for anybody being thrown off.
Yeah.
And so, your third, I'm assessing, I'm like, the EV stuff is the industry. I got laughed out of a room 7 years ago when I brought just the energy information from the projections of the government, which typically tend to be pretty conservative, right, to the projections of EVs. And this was in Houston, oil and gas, really expensive. No way. There's no way. And then if you look at Elon Musk, and he hasn't said he's supporting Trump yet, but the second that kind of starts to move forward, like, I don't know, are we going to have a Republican in office that's now not so anti-EV? It just depends, right? Where his backers are coming from.
Yeah. That's been a fascinating one to watch, the evolution of Elon Musk from planet-saving eco-hero to right-wing shitposter. So it's...
Well, I need to do, a little bit more, but if you start to actually look at, did he change or did the rhetoric change? Right? Because right now, for him the untapped market for his company are the right-wing, non-Tesla loving people. So, sure. I don't know I always caution and think through, like, if the intent is to align with your customers, he already aligned with all of the ones that needed to be aligned with. So now he's got to open up the door to the others. And I think there's EV Hummers. He's got some stiff competition out there.
Yeah. No, that's fair. But given this is an election year, and you mentioned the new EPA regulations on tailpipe emissions that came out just yesterday or the day before, whatever it was, how likely are they to stay if Trump gets elected, for example? I know you said industry behind them broadly, but let's say Trump gets elected. What's to stop him from tearing them up the day after he gets in? Because day one, he wants to be a dictator. I know he said already. So day two, what's to stop him tearing them up and, going back to saying no rules whatsoever on emissions?
Well, there's only so far you can go with the EPA Clean Air Act. And so what is law? And then the mechanisms to reduce regulation, which always happens when you have a Republican come in office. And then the first day when a Democrat has historically come in office, is the first thing they do is they go back to, so Biden went in and went back to Obama's Clean Air Act ruling. But these policies, if and largely why I chose to be on the business side, because of the pendulum swinging constantly in these different directions. And it just seems like a lot of lobbyist and attorney money that maybe could be spent on fighting climate.
Right.
And I'll get to the SEC climate disclosures that I can't even imagine how much companies have spent on attorneys and lobbyists over the last 2 years on this, and it's stalled again. And the whole intent, I'm like, if we had them all disclose what they've spent just on their legal bills and the liability and the concern and what that could have been invested in, rather than fighting it. So I'm not a litigator. It's not been one. I choose to be forward thinking and watch them and to see how far and likely it can actually evolve and change. But to the point of just even taking, the automaker and tailpipe rulings, once a policy is in place, like the voluntary market also is paying attention,
Right.
and the capital markets are as well. And so the investments in U.S. manufacturing are significant. That it's coming out of this Inflation Reduction Act. There's also additional adders to tax credits if you buy American, and these are real jobs. I mean, so and they're in red states.
Right.
So to turn over a piece of policy that you may just it falls under your political preference agenda as to less government, he certainly will do whatever is possible to repeal the work that this administration has done, right? But what will the corporate market, capital markets, how will they respond to that? How does the industry respond to that? Because I mean, it's just moving forward, and the incentives are there. So I think that it'll be an interesting landscape. But I can't even believe we're having this conversation about the one former president running against a former vice president who's now been in office, and then to be clear, the two of them can only be in office for 4 more years, regardless of who they are, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it's just everyone keeps talking about their age difference, and I'm like, well, okay, here we are, but we really need to look at who's working for them, right? And hope that those are going to be the kind of influential parties, in my opinion.
Yeah, fair. You mentioned the infrastructure bill and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. So have they had a big impact on your customers?
Sure. I mean, certainly. And I think, you and I had early on kind of spoken to the history of policy and how it drives markets. I mean, certainly saw that in Spain, right? We were talking about the feed-in tariffs that the utilities and the government had gotten behind that essentially almost bankrupt them, because developers and private companies are very, very savvy and loopholes and figuring out different ways to maximize profits. And so, I think with both bills, I think are driving kind of new innovative business models, and that in its own right really, stimulates new emerging industries. So the amount of just renewable penetration that's gone in the last 18 months is so significant, and what is critical to actually meet all of the new load demand from data centers, AI, now look at all these EVs, direct air capture, where that takes off, not to mention all of the electrification, and we want it all to be clean and all to be stable. There's some interesting opportunities that those developers, I think, that have been in the business for a long time are coming up with, as far as new ways to be more than an infra investment. And then on top of that, you're seeing geothermal, like in a way, that alone is like a fascinating technology that's always been the one left behind, right? I mean, hydrogen was like, it just got to the table 2-3 years ago, and geothermal's always been there too, but it's just the resource and the innovation about how you were going to kind of utilize it is now breaking through. And that to me is what is exciting, because I think, you have a lot of different capabilities at the table looking at these buckets of capital, because they're motivated, because they want to take advantage of this, but they're also bringing the best new kind of perspectives of ways to break through technologies that are not that new. They just haven't maybe been kind of overlapped in the way that they are now.
Okay. Geothermal is quite usually, just by definition of what it is, it's quite usually geo-limited, though, isn't it? There are only certain places where you can roll out geothermal.
Right. Well, but I mean, and I don't claim to be an expert in this because we're just beginning to work on
Right.
this. But in what we're looking at, because with our clients, one of them is we're their energy advisor, right? They need 100% 24/7 clean energy, and they need a lot of it. And so looking at the work we did, we worked with thousands of utilities across the country in the 2000s and really learned regulated utility markets and the different aspects of the generation profiles, so the energy in those markets, and then who regulates them beyond the state and then up to FERC. And so for this last mile of trying to meet the commitments that are really driven by a lot of these tech companies, geothermal, that there's a handful of what is are companies that are looking to use oil and gas technology to break through.
Right.
So it's enhanced, it's enhanced, I say geothermal systems, not enhanced oil recovery, because I don't want to give it a bad rap, but I think that this is like the most exciting convergent of the two technologies we've seen. However, it's fracking, right? They're breaking rock, they're creating the geothermal technology underground in new places. And that's what's innovative about it. But they're also using AI. I mean, there's amazing, cool things that are coming from it. I just don't know. I'm very curious of how the NGOs respond to this.
Yeah. I guess a lot will ride on the grams CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is kind of the metric you want to measure it against. Is this climate bad, for want of a better word, or is it good for the climate? If it's low grams CO2 per kilowatt hour, then excellent. If it's high grams CO2, then we go back to other renewables, solar and wind being the two main ones, I guess.
It's interesting. We've worked quite a bit on kind of the carbon accounting of what is truly clean, green, and how you measure that. And so, and it's coming, I mean, it is still evolving,
Yep.
right? I mean, the way what you just described, I think, is really an interesting calculation. There's multiple different iterations of these calculations, and there's no standard quite yet, but there's demand for it to be. I mean, to be defined by GHG Protocol is running a lot of their own kind of processes, and then even if you look at just even the SEC climate disclosures and everything, and I don't mean to put anybody down for the hard work they've done regarding this, because it is a complex issue, right? I mean, and I think that the environmental impact of producing your widget is an important consideration.
Yep.
Because the customer ultimately should be paying for that, right? So for too long, we've had way too cheap things coming from places that we didn't know how they were made, who was making them, and what they were being made with. And so I think that all of that is bubbled up, and it is a consumer's right to understand how you're conducting your business. But from the climate disclosures, while there's so much litigation right now that's going on, the states are all fighting back, and certainly will have another iteration, I assume, that will come out in the next few months. But if you read behind the lines as to what was ruled, there's some good guidelines in there to say, okay, here's a framework that if I'm going to take and I don't want to get involved, and this is what we do with our clients, is like, let the big guys fight DC and take that on. But what can I take away from this that like I should be thinking about now? And how can I ensure that I'm not up against I need to make up for what I wasn't paying attention to? But if I can proactively say, okay, here's what these implications are. Here's what the cost is going to potentially be for me as a company and a corporation to conduct business. And then ultimately, like, you make the decision on how you are going to optimize your operations.
Right. And you talked in passing as well about the SEC's new rules, and they've been they were put out for comment about 2 years ago now, if I remember correctly. And when they came out with a request for comment on them first back then, they talked about going out to scope 3. They talked about them having to be audited, so they were very robust. And, I kind of sat up and went, whoa, this is impressive. It's going farther than anywhere in Europe. And so in the following 24 months up to now, we've seen them gone back and gone back, to your point, because there's been so much spent on lobbying and lawyers and so on and so on. There's been, I think it was one of the most commented on requests for comments that the SEC ever put out, if I read correctly.
Yeah,
So
I think that's right.
where are we now?
Well, back in, I think that it's back in litigation. So 2 weeks ago, they announced kind of what the requirements were going to be, which had an immediate backlash. And from that, scope 3 was pretty much left out. There were some specifications around what industries were going to be more regulated, which I think is part of kind of the challenges here. And so, for example, if you have a tech company that they make money off of our data,
Yep.
right? And we ultimately pay them to manage it down the line. It's a very different emission profile and environmental profile because scope 3 is huge for them, right? And so trying to get to what they can claim as a carbon-free energy business versus a fertilizer company that is truly actually making something,
Right.
right?
Yep.
The treatment and the regulation around that, it cannot be the same. And then go into the states have their own environmental rules around their requirements that have already been passed and authorized to them. So it's very complex, but where I think it will continue to go and continue to evolve. 2 years ago, I don't think anybody was even talking about scope 3. 4 years ago, ESG was just, coming to the table. Yeah. I think it was 5 years ago, it was responsible investing, right? And so, who knows where we'll be in the next 5 years, but I certainly think that you can take enough of these points to evaluate your business and what you want to focus on and where the liabilities are and risk. But Europe has one of the most aggressive regulations around climate than any industry in the globally. So we have a lot of federal oversight. I don't know, do you see, because I recently read that they've almost taken it too far and that there's pushback there, but I don't know. Who knows what you're reading? I'm curious of your perspective there.
Sure. Yeah. No, you'll always get pushback when there are new regulations come out. And we had CSRD be approved here recently, which is kind of the equivalent to the SEC rules we're talking about, except to go further. And yeah, there is a little bit, or there has been a little bit of pushback, as there always will be to, as I said, to new regulations. But my personal perspective is they don't go far enough because they don't mandate scope 3 to be audited. Now, they're
right.
That will come. It will come here. It will come in the US as well through the SEC eventually. As you said, 4 years ago, no one was talking about ESG. In 4 years, 5 years' time, scope 3 will be part of the rules and regs, if not at the SEC level, at least at the state level. And, beyond that, it'll become required to be reported with the same stringency as financial reporting is today, just because of where the climate is and the trend lines in climate, and it's getting more serious. So that's, to my mind, that's the way things are going to go. Maybe happen in Europe, likely happen in Europe before the US.
Well, and there's a risk associated with it, right? So shareholders have a right to transparent information regarding where those risks are, or at least line of sight that they're investing in a company that has some expertise in it, I would say. But it's interesting, the geopolitical dynamic of how different these countries are regulated by and how these markets are driven. But then, we're building this entire energy industry of maximum production across all resources, right. Which when I was in the business in 2003, we weren't exporting oil, we weren't exporting natural gas, we were certainly not exporting any renewable equipment yet. And so it's interesting in just 20 years to see where the US is as far as our energy economy and what we're poised to potentially be able to build not only within our country, but also abroad. You have to pay attention to all of the other policies,
Yeah.
right? So, for example, if you look at the LNG export, it's not a ban, it's a pause, but it's chaotic, right? It goes way upstream. Impact, kind of looking at the environmental aspect of those projects. And then if you're going to export, what those countries are truly requiring to be defined to meet their thresholds. So last year, was huge. The last 2 years, I guess, have been building all of this infrastructure to be able to support countries like Ukraine, Europe, that we have a lot of safer practices in the U.S. and environmentally and labor,
Yeah.
right? So I'm all about any U.S. production, but we do have to recognize that, like, in order to sell to our allies, they have their own requirements too.
Sure, sure. And in terms of manufacturing in the US, that's on the rise at the moment. Off the back, I got to think of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Infrastructure Act. Is that helping? How is that affecting the energy space? I guess is the question I'm coming to.
Well, so the plants have they're just breaking ground,
Right.
right? So, but the add-ons to tax credits, let's take solar for example. If you have a solar project in a environmental justice community and can create a really strong community engagement plan and use the labor requirements and buy American product, like that tax package is, can be up to 70% of a tax credit
Right.
for your project. Now, having all of that add up and then meet the IRS requirements is challenging, right? So
Sure.
with federal money comes federal requirements. However, I do think that there was, so much historically that was kind of looked past as far as our products that were coming from China. And there it has improved, the transparency has improved, but I do hear a lot of oil and gas companies pointing to why renewables are not clean and good because of China made panels. And we are addressing that by this U.S. manufacturing. You see a lot of foreign companies that are taking business into the U.S. for that very reason.
Yep.
So it's exciting. I think that to look at just the carbon footprint alone of a solar panel that is actually made in the U.S. and then installed in the U.S., like that carbon footprint right there, to me, was never really part of this clean equation. But it's going to drive up prices. It was too cheap, right?
Sure.
And so, but the tax credits are structured to kind of incentivize and offset that.
Cool. We are coming towards the end of the podcast now, Emily. Is there any question that I haven't asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to think about?
Well, I think that, I'll just follow up with our last conversation when we were discussing renewables and the growth, and kind of, I get this question a lot of, is it too late, right? Like, is it streamlined now? And the amount of solar and wind that is going to be built out between now and 2030 is unbelievable. And so I think that the opportunities for, all industry to get behind the new technology and look at it from a more neutral perspective without political views is going to only create, more profitable businesses. But I greatly appreciate the time, Tom. I always like hearing another perspective, and especially connecting with you and where you are in Spain, and just appreciate, the opportunity to talk today.
Thank you. One thing we didn't mention, actually, now that I think about it, is storage. Is that something that you're coming across as well? Because there's some projects in the US, in California in particular, where storage has played a big part. So the combination of renewables plus storage, is that coming across your desk as well?
Absolutely. I think that at this point in the game, be surprising to see a project without a battery associated with it, either that is part of the system or that is, utilizing the land for what is a value add to the utility. But that, I mean, alone is unbelievable of how it is completely commercialized and scaled in a way that was the holy grail in the 2000s, that every utility said once storage becomes kind of affordable and reliable, then it changes everything. I think some of the new longer duration storage technologies that are out there are really important to watch. And no, I mean, I certainly think that batteries, wherever they are going to be what helps us get through all of the changing dynamics between demand and supply.
Yeah. I've had some interesting episodes dealing just with storage. I had one with a company that makes vanadium flow batteries, for example, which are ideal for utilities. And I had another with companies that make heat batteries, which are particularly useful for industry, for example. I've had two episodes on that. So no, it's a fascinating space to keep an eye on. So cool.
It definitely is. I mean, the innovation that's going into the true engineering behind across the board is fascinating to me. We look at it from the market's perspective and how those technologies either would impact an operations ability to truly rely on it, or in what the life cycle is, right? So I don't know. It's going to be an interesting few years to see which ones actually take off.
Definitely. Emily, that's been fascinating. If people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed in the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn, Emily Easley. I'm always, it's the easiest. And then Novus Energy Advisors, so Novus, energyadvisors.com is our website. And we're always looking to meet new people and talk about energy.
Perfect. Tremendous. Emily, that's been fascinating. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, Tom. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks. You too.